So this is the video for Lesson 9. What I want to draw your attention to first of all is the fact that I neglected to put the discussion post prompt up for Lesson 8 for the practice and demonstrate. So make sure to follow back up with that. I've posted it now, and I've also added it to the student tasks list on the PowerPoint for Lesson 9. And as I've been trying to remind you a lot about, make sure you're also taking care of the QQCs and the self-reflections. Those things all add up quite a lot to your participation grade, participation and professionalism grade, and that accounts for 15% of your total grade. So make sure that you're keeping up with that. Okay, so in Lesson 9, we're really going to focus in on ways of listening and understanding, and then crack open and look at active listening in a lot more detail than we have already. So some ways of listening. What I've done is taken a little bit of some information from a book by a man named Alfred Benjamin. It's named The Helping Interview. The book is called The Helping Interview. It's really for psychotherapists, but it's really a great guide to be able to open up a conversation as you're trying to either relay information or receive information or both. And so I'd really recommend it. It's kind of one of those old classic books. I think it was written in the 70s or something like that. So in any case, in that book, and I think this is a useful way of thinking about different ways of listening, and it actually reflects a lot of much more modern ways of thinking about conversation and communication overall. We can think about content listening, and that's directly thinking about what's being said. Okay, so analyzing the words that are being used and the logic being used, and what pieces of information you're getting from another person. Very useful way of thinking, very useful way of listening, because we have to understand lots about what other people are saying, and we have to know what they're saying, of course. Another way is delivery listening. We're basically watching the person with a little more detail, orienting ourselves to how things are being said. Okay, so what it is that the person is telling us with their bodies, with their tones of voice, things like that. That's sort of like reading between the lines, as they say. Now, content listening and delivery listening are sort of building on one another. And process listening incorporates those two things and actually goes a little beyond that as well. So in process listening, we're listening for and watching for what's not being said, but is yet still being communicated. Or what might be a useful way to think about this, we'll come back to this later, a useful way of thinking about process listening is what is being spoken behind the words. And it takes, that's a skill to be able to use, to be able to hear and to extract out what's being said behind the words. And it uses content and delivery listening together and kind of comes up with a synthesis of those things to infer a little about the state of mind and the state of the emotions of the other person. Okay, so that's going to be very important for us as we move into listening to young children especially, and also listening to various family members on a deep, deep level. So that was 3 ways of thinking about listening, and 3 ways of understanding. So as we're listening, either through strictly content listening, delivery listening, or process listening, that's kind of deeper and deeper layers of listening, we're also having to understand and make sense of what we hear, or what we see in different ways. One way that a person can understand someone as they're listening to them at any of those levels is basically how others might see them. That's a labeling kind of understanding. Oh, I've got you. You're this kind of person, or you fit in this category, so I know you as that type of thing now. And that is in a rough sketch kind of what stereotyping is. And stereotyping with objects and sometimes with people can actually be kind of useful. It kind of gives you a quick and dirty snapshot of what it might be that you're going to interact with. If it stops there, however, then you've closed the door on your further understanding of the person, and that can be hindering, okay, to any relationship at all. So another way of understanding is this is a little bit more of a deep level also, as understanding how you see them. And that takes stereotyping and kind of applies it to, okay, well, how do I react to that? And whatever I react to, that must be right, because that's how I understand them. That's a kind of finger pointing outward, right? So that you're thinking about the other person is doing something, it makes me feel XYZ. And that phrase, makes me feel, is kind of key. The reactivity is that it's assumed that because you feel a certain way, it's true that that person made you feel that way. So stereotyping based on how others see someone as a label kind of thing. Reactivity based on how you see them, but in an automatic kind of reactive way. And then there's understanding someone as they might see themselves. And that's a deeper kind of listening, or understanding rather, that includes, necessarily includes a degree of compassion or empathy. That's what empathy means, essentially. It means to be in the person's shoes, as they say, seeing through their eyes. Compassion literally means suffering with. So passion is kind of like a suffering of sort, and the prefix come means with. So we're kind of suffering or feeling with the person, and that's understanding with rather than understanding about. And that's what we're going for when we're thinking about seeing someone or understanding someone as they see themselves. We're stepping into their bodies and their skins and their experience and trying to understand with rather than understand purely about. Okay? Okay, so some nonverbal communication domains that are really, really important. This covers a lot of nonverbal communication, and in fact, in our texts, one of the books that we're reading, it's more phrased like paralanguage and timing and body language. So paralanguage is kind of like extra language. So in these terms, it would be something like the tone of voice, things like that, as we get to it. So eye contact is first. I'm basing this list off of someone I've mentioned before, I'm sure, the psychiatrist Dan Siegel. He uses a sort of small mnemonic device. He's really good at those, and does this. And I would encourage you to practice this, because your actual practice component will have a lot to do with this. So you say eye contact, or eyes, facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gestures, timing, and intensity. And if you've YouTubed Dan Siegel at all, you might have even run into that. So again, try to follow along with me. If you're in a coffee shop, you might not feel so comfortable doing this. But if you're alone or later on, try to do these movements, because it'll help you actually remember what to look for in nonverbal communication. Okay? So we're going to do it again. Use your hands to point to these things. Eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gestures, timing, and intensity. All right? Good. So practice that a little bit on your own. It may seem kind of silly, but you're going to need to memorize these things, so I want you to practice it like that. So let's go through each one of these in a little bit more detail. Eyes. So the eye contact is really important because of because of lots of reasons, but one reason in particular is a specific point on the back of the retina that's a small depression where it's called the fovea, or the foveal point. And this is a point at which the retinal cones, there's cones and rods that receive light signals to allow us to see. The center of that field of vision, so whatever you're looking at right now, the very center dot of that vision field is the fovea. And that's where the highest density or collection of cones are. And it's basically what you see in the most clarity or detail out of all of your field of vision. And it's necessarily right in the very center of it. And when you look into the center of someone else's eyes, or you feel someone else looking at you in the center of your eyes, in that foveal point, there's something about that feels a little bit more close, a little bit more of like a contact. It's almost like you're touching visual fields. It feels like, it can even feel invasive, can feel disarming. So if you say, for instance, sometimes in marriage counseling retreats, couples will be asked to stare in each other's eyes for a matter of minutes, like 3 to 5 minutes. That doesn't sound like a hard task, but if you've ever really looked into someone's eyes for a long period of time, you might notice that it begins to feel a little uncomfortable, depending on who the person is, maybe. And especially with strangers, that we often find ourselves, I'm sure you might also, notice catching an eye of a stranger, and if you continue staring in their eyes, it might send some sort of message that you don't want to, for good or bad. So that's a good example of how powerful the very center of our visual field is, and what eye contact does to communicate things. Facial expression. So facial expression is really interesting because whereas our two hemispheres of our brains actually control the opposite sides of our bodies, right? So my left hand is basically guided by my right hemisphere of my brain. Some evidence supports the fact that it's actually at least partially different with the face. Now, from the nose up and the nose down is basically kind of a laterality, or up and down split, rather. So what's been shown, at least some evidence supports this, is that the right brain, which is a little guides us a little more unconsciously in general, actually might control the top half of the face. And what that means is that when we, an example of what that means is when we smile, you might notice that there's two ways of smiling, at least. One is a kind of like a fake smile, and one is a more genuine smile. The technical names for that are a Duchenne smile, which is a full, authentic smile, and a non-Duchenne smile. Duchenne is the name of the person that kind of pointed this out. Duchenne, I believe, if you want to look it up. So it's a little bit more non-conscious control in the top half of the face, and a little bit more conscious control, left side of the brain, on the bottom half of the face. The left side of the brain generally controls language too, or at least it guides it a little more directly. So it makes sense that the bottom half of the face, where the mouth is, would be under left hemispheric control. And you can kind of practice what this feels like in a certain way, because when you laugh, especially if it's an uncontrollable laugh, you might notice that your eyes are a lot more involved, the top half of your face. And you can also see when someone smiles that they sometimes have crow's feet like this. And it's a little bit harder to fake a good smile because of that phenomenon at the eyes. I've even heard the phrase smizing, which means that you smile with your eyes. And that might be considered something like a Duchenne smile. So when you're thinking about facial expression and you're smiling a kind of bottom half of the face smile, you might actually be sending a sort of subliminal message to someone that you're forcing the smile, and you might not mean as much of what you're trying to show with that smile. So that's something to keep in mind. So tone of voice. The tone of voice is changed or altered by the tightening or relaxation of the larynx and pharynx, among other things. Those are two sets of muscles in the voice box. When the sympathetic nervous system, that's the fight-flight response we've talked about before. That's when we feel agitated, reactive, irritable, annoyed, angry, anxious, those things. Our body changes in a lot of different ways, and one of those ways is the tightening, generally, of our larynx and pharynx. That's why when we can feel upset, sometimes we might notice our voice tone rising a little bit. Our voice gets a little higher, and it can be it can be quite exhausting too as you continue speaking. And what that also does is it sends a message to the other person that, based on your tone of voice, that you might be in more of a reactive state. And that's something that we understand about each other, but aren't always able to put our fingers on to sort of understand it as we listen to people. Okay, so postures. Just a couple of things about posture. I'd like for you to think about a sort of spectrum, a line spectrum, where on one end there's total passivity, where someone's very passive or timid or allows themselves to be basically walked on or used, and then that moving over into something like aggression on the far other side, where they're trying more to control or manipulate others or by force. And then in the middle, there's something like assertiveness. And assertiveness is more like a calm confidence that balances a kind of receptivity of another person and flexibility of response. It balances that with a little bit more of an assertiveness of what it is that you might want to say or do. Okay, so it's a balance, and you can sort of see that balance play out in body posture quite a lot. So if I'm sitting forward and like my shoulders are up and my arms are forward and I'm leaning in toward you, that might be something like engagement. But depending on the conversation, depending on my facial expression, tone of voice, and other things, you might perceive that as aggression as well, like I'm trying to force something on you or control something of the situation. Likewise, when we might sulk or kind of turn away or shoulders up in a kind of timid way, we might appear or give the impression of a meekness or a passivity. And so your job when communicating might have to do with balancing those things so that you understand what posture your body is producing and what message that might send, as well as understanding what other people's postures might mean in conversations. So gestures, in straightforward terms, we can really just think of the question, what are our hands and arms saying, right? So we all talk with our hands and arms, some more than others, but basically thinking about what that might mean as you're watching a person and as you're using your own gestures. Timing can be thought of as like conversational space. It's kind of like the canvas on which our conversations are illustrated, okay? It's a little like music as well. So music has timing, and so does conversation and dialogue. And sometimes you might find yourself in a conversation where another person is overruling or overtaking the space of conversation, that timing. That means they might just continue to talk rapid fire, and it's really hard to get a word in. Otherwise, you might notice a person you can be speaking with just seem to leave way too much space so that you don't even quite understand if they're thinking or if they want to respond to you or if they're ignoring you. So there's a balance of that too. And you might examine throughout all of these your own propensities or your own natural kind of habits, because you might be one of those people who are really quick and rapid fire talker, or you might be one of those people who notices that you spend a lot of time listening to others and don't quite put your opinion there without waiting too long. Tensity, lastly, tensity just basically means volume and pressure or force, right? So you can tell what kind of an underlying message might be to a comment that someone might make based on how loud they speak, and then how forceful the voice seems to come out of them, right? So that's kind of that pressure aspect of intensity. And so all these things I'd like for you to think about practicing observing in others and yourself by remembering the eyes, facial expression, tone of voice, postures, gestures, timing, and intensity. Just remember that kind of physical mnemonic device so that you can keep track of all those things as you work with them. Now, your practice assignment for this week, I would like for you to complete a social observation journal. So you have the steps there. Basically, I want you to memorize the list I just went over with you. And then take one entire day. I want you to spend the whole day as a part of your day, waking up thinking you're going to recite these things to yourself to memorize them. Okay? So every time you move into a social exchange, and by that I mean a time in which you'll be communicating or interacting with another person, I want you to recite these things to yourself. And then when you enter into that engagement or that dialogue with that person, no matter how long or short it is, I think, I put it on the PowerPoint, you can have an in-depth, really close conversation with a loved one or a single phrase interaction with a stranger. I want you to think about these things through all of those. And just observe your own and the others' use of nonverbal communication. And for the actual submission of the assignment, I want you to keep a record of how many times you recited this list to yourself during that one day. And think of this as like you're a zoologist. You're kind of just standing back even from yourself and observing without even making judgments about it. Simply observing what's happening. Okay. Take quick notes as you enter in and out of those types of conversations, and make notes of things that you observed, again, from the other and from within yourself. So I'm going to ask you to compile some of your notes as though, again, you were just walking around exhibits of animals and observing their behaviors, okay? But do so for others and yourself. Make a list of those notes, and so this is all day, so you'll have several opportunities throughout the day to do this, and then share them as a discussion post, and I'll also want you to reply to the others' discussion posts as well, simply making observations about what they reported. Okay, so we're going to quickly go over some active listening to review what we've already covered with active listening. Active listening is basically taking on another's frame of reference. That's something that you can think about. It has a lot to do with empathy. That's kind of what that means. Review the 5 essential elements of active listening. You're paying attention, showing you're present. Demonstrate that you're listening. Provide feedback. Defer judgment, and then respond appropriately. So you have a couple of pages in your teacher's guide text to review those things. So, ways to perform those essential elements. I've given you a list of some really crucial aspects of active listening. The first has to do with kind of like that conversational space, that timing, and it's silence. So silence can be used to great effect in lots of different ways. You can hear lots of great speech writers, for instance, or speech orators give a lot of use to silence. And when we see this used in conversation, when you try it in conversation, you might notice that there are lots of different effects that it can have. You can send really positive, really warm, and also really cold or dismissive messages with silence. So it has to be used appropriately. Now, I put the phrase in on this PowerPoint. Means, yes, I'm still present. I'm still listening to you. I'm still engaged. It doesn't have to be all of those sounds. It can be any other things, like okay, yes, or all right. Just little phrases like that to drop in every once in a while to fill spaces to let them know you're still engaged. Clarification of facts. Now, clarification can be really of 2 sorts. Clarification for the other simply means that you're taking their language and might simplify it or help them organize it to make it more of a universal language so that it can be shared with you and with other people. It actually might help them clarify it within their minds, their own minds. And then another type is clarification for you, the listener, because it might just not be clear, and that is a useful mechanism to be able to say, hold on, let me make sure I've got you right. Is this what you mean? Now, restatements might actually serve the purpose of clarification, but it also might serve other purposes. Restatements can be thought of as having 4 types. You either literally restate something. So if someone says, gosh, I was stressed this morning, might not be the most smooth way of reciting literally, because you would literally say, I felt stressed this morning. Now, that might be used more with a young child, but can actually can be pretty helpful. And so that's slightly altered for the second type, where you're actually changing just the pronoun. So you might not use the literal restatement quite as much when they're talking about themselves, but with the pronoun, you just switch the pronoun to refer to them. So say a child says, he hit me and it hurt. You would say something to restate it as he hit you and it hurt you. That simply is the same information they provided you with, but it actually allows them to know that you're engaged and allows them to see what it is that they're expressing to others as well. So a partial restatement might simply pick out something that you feel is really important in the statement. That example I just gave you, you could highlight the fact that the child was hurt and say, that really hurt you. Just to restate it. It's not quite a probing or a question. It's simply a stating again of what the other said. Now, a summary restatement is a little bit more like putting it into your own words. And it's still a simple restatement. You're not asking for a clarification, although you might get one. It's simply a restatement of what you're hearing the other saying in your own words. Now, in reflection is basically a mirroring or an echoing of the underlying feeling, tone, and attitude of what the other is saying. This is listening behind the words that you're hearing. Okay, so this requires a different kind of deeper empathic listening. So you have to recognize what's behind the words in the other, and then verbalize them in front of them, so that they kind of hear you hearing them. Right, and that's the really important part of reflection. And it's, again, not about the content of the words or even the delivery of the words, but more like back to that different ways of listening, the process of what's happening. Okay, so validation is something that you can often follow. That can often follow reflection. Some simple phrases that might allow you to validate something that someone else says. Now, validation isn't just saying you're right all the time. It's actually picking out what you can agree with or understand and then state that back to them. Something you might think of, a phrase, is that it makes sense that, or I could see how you would think or feel what it was that they're thinking or feeling. It's really important for you to be actually authentic when you say this. You actually have to mean what you say. If someone is in an argument with someone, you actually don't agree with their side of the argument, but they say something like, it makes me so infuriated when they say this kind of thing because it hurts my feelings. And you might even say, even if you disagree with the person's argument, you can say, it kind of makes sense to me that if they were to say something to hurt your feelings, you would feel angry about that. And that actually can help bridge gaps between people who are having disagreements quite well. Okay, so lastly, interpretation or explanation. This serves as an orienting purpose for both the listener and the speaker, and can really fall into the danger of sounding like a know-it-all, so that's a really difficult thing to balance. But in general, interpreting what another's saying, or even explaining something to someone to help them with a sense of understanding, has to be descriptive, logical, factual, even impersonal. So you're not saying, you don't understand, but I'm smart enough to help you understand. That's condescending in a know-it-all kind of way. You're actually trying to take an impersonal approach so that you're allowing both of you to come to a deeper understanding together, right? So you come with the assumption that they might have something to teach you, and you might have something to share with them that could lead to their insight. In general, you might think about orienting to a situation, helping explain the environment and what happened. Behavior, so simply pointing out or explaining a certain type of behavior, maybe particularly to like a parent. And in addition to that, the cause of either a behavior or an event. And then also the explanation of the position of the professional, of you. So that might be a little bit more like, in my role as this child's teacher, as this child's therapist or caregiver, this is actually what is appropriate here. So that's a little bit more of an informative kind of statement from the position of a professional. Okay, so those are some kind of mechanisms of active listening that I'm hoping you'll be able to try out and use. Two of them that I want you to really focus on this week in your demonstrate assignment are silence and reflection. So look back at silence and reflection, remembering that reflection really just refers to the listening behind the words, the mirroring or echoing of the emotional tone behind words that another might be saying. And I want you to purposefully utilize it in some conversations in your own life. Okay. Now, the second part of this demonstrate, which you'll submit as an assignment, I would like you to actually prepare yourself to try to recreate that conversation as best that you can. I want you to actually try to notate it after you've had it and submit it to me, sort of like the movie script we did earlier in the term. And in brackets, I want you to place the certain things that you might notice about some nonverbals, okay? So the example I gave you is if you're speaking with someone and they say, well, and they kind of look away or look down or turn their eyes away from you, that would be something that you would put in brackets, right? The example I gave is she broke eye contact and looked down and away from me. That would be the bracketed portion highlighting the nonverbal communication of eye contact and maybe even body posture as well. And so submit this recreated dialogue as an assignment, okay? So a couple more reminders to make sure you submit the Lesson 8 practice and demonstrate discussion post that I didn't prepare for you to submit last week. And then also your children's books annotated bibliography is due this week. So make sure that you're submitting that on Blackboard. And just email me if there are any complications with that. Now, I think I reminded you about this before, but this week I'm not asking you to submit a QQC. All right, so there's just a little bit of the reading for review this week, so you can spend that extra time working on your other assignments and make sure that you get the bibliography submitted. There is, however, a self-reflection of just a few prompts, so make sure that you're following through with that to submit that on Blackboard as well. Okay, so that's all for Lesson 9. Just contact me if you need any help with anything, and make sure that you're remembering that the due date for this is actually extended to next Tuesday. Okay? So get in touch with me if you need any help.